So far, we have done a quick flyover of the entire history of civilization from its known inception through to the beginning of the 20th century, as represented in our statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And while the proportions of the statue are normal, the represented time frames are not. If you look at the period of the head of gold through the midsection of bronze, that covers a span of 500 years. If you consider the legs alone, you're looking at a period of 2,000 years, and every generation, beginning with the apostles themselves, have been waiting for his long-expected return. So, how do we, or anyone else for that matter, know if their generation is the lucky recipient? After all, there have been a litany of would-be theologians that have misfired on that point. I'd like to offer a hopefully not too oversimplified illustration. We'll use this railroad trestle, then we'll drop our little man right in the middle of the bridge and have him stand carefully, right between the two tracks running in both directions. And as time passes, sure enough, one of the trains whizzes by. That direction happens to be the past. And what do we know about the past? It's always 100% correct. So how does that help us? The same way and for the same purpose that it was useful for Israel. As with any prognostication, the closer you get to the fulfillment of a foreseen event, the clearer the details become. You can begin to identify the current events you are experiencing with the representations given in the related prophecy. It's a technique or procedure, if you will, that scholars call billboarding. As time passes and we get closer and closer to those future events, concrete signs begin to appear, much like this billboard on a superhighway running through the city en route to its final destination. And the ads become more specific the closer we get. In this case, we have Jesus' prediction, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand." Well, in order to have that event take place, you have to have a holy place. In order to have a holy place, you have to have someone build it. And the location is presumed to be Israel, which would necessitate the Jews having some form of occupation in the land and the capacity to carry out the task of construction. Therefore, the Jews must first return to Israel. But prior to the past century, that would not have seemed to be remotely possible, as no civilization that has disappeared from history has ever risen again. None. Let's take a look at past civilizations that have gone extinct. Here we have 11 civilizations that have long since passed with their born-on and death dates. And for a civilization, nation, or empire to exist, they all have exactly the same characteristics. They have a common language, a defined culture, a national identity, and defined borders. But what happens when they are conquered by a more powerful nation? They are absorbed into that dominant society. And what do they lose? They immediately lose their national identity and borders. And within a few short generations, their language and culture disappear. Now let's take a look at the Jews. Over the past 2,000 years, they have migrated all over the entire planet. Currently, 68% live in the United States, and when you include the UK, Canada, the West Bank, and France, that totals to 86% of all Jews in the world. That's throughout 5 countries. But what about the other 14%? In how many other countries do they retain citizenship? How about just short of 100? When Israel refers to a dispersion, that definitely meets the criteria. But let's go back to the results of domination. Did the population of dispersed Jews ever become completely absorbed into any one of these dominant cultures? No. Live with any Jewish family anywhere in the world, and you will fairly quickly realize that they have definitely retained much of their cultural customs, and, by and large, their language. Yes, they have all learned to speak the language of the dominant culture, but they have all adapted some form of their original Hebrew language and dialect, Yiddish, for example. But, lo and behold, what happened for the first time in all of known history? A totally defeated and exiled nation was brought to life when Israel was reestablished as a nation in 1948. And what instantly occurred? They instantly reacquired a national identity and borders, and since that time they have also revived their once ancient and dead language. But that raises a question, the elephant in the room. Why has it been 2,000 years? There is a valid and reasonable biblical response to that question. Everyone knows that Israel sinned. Their history is replete with their offenses toward God. Even any good rabbi will admit to that. But what triggers a national sin to warrant the execution of a penalty? What is one of the most prominent aspects? When established and sanctioned leadership enacts and practices laws that are in direct conflict with the way God intended man to behave, there are serious consequences. We don't have time to discuss all those major civilizations that are now in the dustbin of history, but that basic principle applied to them also. But our concentration is on Israel. In this case, the book of Jeremiah the prophet records, "They have defiled my land, they have filled my inheritance with the carcasses of their detestable and abominable idols." Overall, outside of David's reign, Israel's track record was pretty miserable. Even his son Solomon did not do well in that department. So what was the Lord's determination? What would be his penalty? He simply states that it will be double. Scripture often employs a pattern of doubling, but doubling of what? For the answer to that, we have to go to 1 Samuel chapter 8 to read, "Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations." That did not make Samuel happy. So he went to the Lord and consulted him, and the Lord told Samuel not to worry. They weren't rejecting Samuel, they were rejecting the Lord. He told Samuel to move forward, go ahead, give them what they want, and of course, all the consequences that will ultimately come with that decision. And Saul became their first king. And when did this coronation occur? Approximately 1000 BC. So my surmising arrives at a double penalty. They not only worshipped other gods, using rituals that were not only debasing, but even to the extent of Baal worship, burning their children for sacrifice. In addition, they killed every prophet for that 1,000-year stretch, and in the end, they killed his son on the cross. Now, for the sake of full disclosure, I have not found one theologian who has even presented this idea, let alone having subscribed to it. It is my assumption that this is the underlying cause, but I would like to proffer the relationship of a literal 1,000 years being represented as one day, and see where that takes us. First we go to Psalm 90. "For 1,000 years in your sight, it's like a watch in the night." And Peter made reference to it in one of his letters. One day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. Again, I can't substantiate or support my theory with the studies of scholars, or any one scholar for that matter, but no one else has even approached the subject of the 2,000-year absence since Jesus' resurrection and ascension. Many, I'd even say most people of this generation don't believe that Jesus is God, let alone that he will return. If we believe his return to be true, then we have to assume that he will return as he promised. It has always bothered me that there has been this inexplicably long absence without God giving some clues as to where we are on this unknowable timeline. But I believe he has. I want to begin with the dispersion of the Jews since the destruction of the temple and consider the circumstances of recent history that could give us a clue that we're nearing the end of that particular timeline. This is the famous painting, The Sack of the Temple of Jerusalem, by the renowned Italian artist Francesco Hayez. Notice in the lower left side of the picture the two Roman soldiers, along with another shadowy figure, holding up the menorah which was taken from the temple. This painting was done in the 1800s, so how would Francesco know what the menorah looked like? This is the Arch of Constantine, still in excellent condition and standing near the Colosseum and the Roman Forum. And if you ever visit Rome, be sure to observe some of the reliefs on the inside walls of the arch. You will see this relief: the Romans carrying off the very menorah from Herod's temple. Well, 2,000 years have passed, and possibly, very possibly, the penalty has been served. So we go back to Scripture, and we find, as we read in Isaiah, "Comfort, yes, comfort my people, says your God. Speak comfort to Jerusalem, and cry out to her, that her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned, for she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins." And we read in Isaiah, "Instead of your shame you shall have double honor, and instead of confusion they shall rejoice in their portion. Therefore in their land they shall possess double. Everlasting joy shall be theirs." And in Zechariah, "Even today I declare, I will restore double to you." And finally, Hosea, "Come, and let us return to the Lord, for he has torn, but he will heal us. He has stricken, but he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up, that we may live in his sight." This is, of all those scriptures, the most interesting to me personally. There are very few commentaries that give this passage much attention, and of those that do, they're not very clear. Some do speculate that this might be a reference to the resurrection. But two things mitigate against that. The surrounding scriptures of this passage concern Israel's eventual restoration, and the other being that Christ was raised after 3 days, not 2, and that the focus of this resurrection is not Jesus, but Israel, and for the purpose of living with their Lord, that we may live in his sight. Of course, we can spiritualize this and find some other or additional meaning, but if taken literally, it fits perfectly with the 1,000-year reign with Christ, as referenced in Revelation. What is amazing is that there are a significant number of biblical scholars who would deny the millennium as being literal. I do disagree with that particular point of view, and if world conditions keep doing a military speed march in its current direction, I guess we'll discover the answer to that question soon enough. All of this brings us to the present and the activities of the Temple Institute, founded by Rabbi Yisrael Ariel in 1987 for the purpose of recreating and restoring the sacred vessels and artifacts used in the Holy Temple destroyed in 70 A.D. Here is the first of more than 24 of those artifacts. This menorah is over 100 pounds, 45 kilos, of gold, and it is approximately 6 feet tall. And if you recognize its style, you'd be correct in matching it with the relief on Constantine's arch, because that's exactly the image from which they copied it. I'm going to do a quick scroll through 17 of the more than 60 implements crafted to the exact original specifications of the original temple and are being prepared for immediate use when the new temple in Jerusalem is built. All of these are on display at the Temple Institute's Visitor Center in the Jewish quarter of the Old City in Jerusalem. I'll allow for just a few seconds per image. If you wish to view them longer, just pause the tape. The next image is one of two red heifers chosen from the herd of red heifers which have been bred for over the past decade. These are perfect heifers, meaning that an appointed priest of the new upcoming temple examines every hair, which must be uniform in color, and the animal can have no physical defects. It will be sacrificed with its ashes intended for the required purification ceremonies once the temple's construction is completed. So, where are we now? To get a better grasp of that, we need to go back to the progression of power in Europe over the past approximate 200 years. For those of you who haven't seen our earlier videos, there is an entire section that explores the implications of the passage in the book of Daniel surrounding verse 43 of chapter 2, referencing the mingling with the seed of men. We explore the power shift of the Western Roman Empire after the reign of the Caesars to the dominance of kings and kingdoms throughout Europe until the modern age. It is this last 200-year period which saw the progressive demise of the dominance of rule by royalty to self-rule through independence and the growing rights of the individual. With this transition, the final conditions for the return of the Jews and the reestablishment of Israel as a nation were complete. The images you see here demonstrate the number of houses of royalty in Europe at the time of the American Revolution, followed by the dilution of that power post-World War I and World War II, and finally the year Israel was reestablished and recognized by the international community as a nation for the first time in 2,000 years. To summarize this progression, here is the list of events that set the stage for Israel's return to the Holy Land. The success of the American Revolution and a constitutional government of, by, and for its citizenry was unprecedented and had an immediate effect throughout all of Europe, signaling the burgeoning of nationalism. Laws encouraging the rights of the individual to participate in every aspect of society, regardless of class distinction, became prevalent and written into the laws of virtually every country on the continent. As a result, Jews began enjoying the benefits of entry into many aspects of society from which they had previously been restricted. That would principally be land ownership, participation in government, and the military. And as their participation increased, there was a twofold effect: increase in wealth and an obvious crowding effect of positions on every level. Conversations increased about how minority groups, obviously including the Jews, would and could be integrated into society. A German philosopher, Bruno Bauer, published a book in 1843, Die Judenfrage, the Jewish question, which focused on this subject and became a common expression. The inherent difficulties of integration on such a large scale was obviously not lost on the entire Jewish population. They themselves began opening discussion among themselves the idea of a homeland of their own. Theodor Herzl was a Hungarian attorney turned journalist who began espousing the idea of the creation of a Jewish state as a solution to the Jewish question, and published his book Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State, in 1896, and subsequently created the World Zionist Organization, becoming its first president, and convening the first Zionist Congress in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland. Or is that Basel? Whichever. This is where everything converges and begins falling into place, the First World War. The Allies were losing and needed the financial help that the Jewish community could supply. And since most Jews who had lived in Eastern Europe now resided in the United States, there was added hope that the U.S. could be persuaded to add their efforts to the war. Additionally, the Allies also hoped to persuade the Arab community to join their military might against the Ottomans, their natural rivals. Consequently, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour had a close relationship with Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild, descendant of the wealthy Rothschild international banking family. Balfour supported and encouraged Rothschild in his efforts and involvement in Zionism, writing a private letter to Rothschild suggesting efforts to assist the establishment of an independent Jewish state after the war. Subsequently, the Balfour Declaration, drafted by the British, made commitments to Jewish leadership that they would assist, if winning the war, in establishing a Jewish state with defined territories in Palestine. Unfortunately, the Arabs were only given verbal commitments that they, too, would be assisted in acquiring their own domicile in the Middle East region. As we know, those promises did not materialize. Before we can move any further in understanding how all the current conflicts in the Middle East, and for that matter throughout the entire world, are going to be resolved, we need to wrap our arms around the particular nuances of the Balfour Declaration that seem to be entirely overlooked. These basic elements are the foundation of the conflict, and it is only the return of Jesus who will bring final resolution. So, right now we're going to watch a short video explaining the specifics of that document that are the source of the conflict, presented by Dr. Joshua Landis, the head of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. And after the video, I am going to give you a reading assignment in preparation for the next video lesson in our series about Jesus' return and the future for those who are faithful and for Israel. So let's take the next 10 minutes to listen.
In discussing the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is at the center of U.S. interests in the Middle East and has been for the last century, it's important to start with the Balfour Declaration. One of the treaties that was issued during World War I in order to fight the war was the Balfour Declaration. And it's important, it lays the groundwork for understanding how the British dealt with the Jews in Palestine and how the international community has adjudicated the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's a very simple declaration. It was issued in November 2nd, 1917, by Sir Balfour, who was the Foreign Minister of Great Britain, to Lord Rothschild, a leading British Jew who was a member of the Zionist World Organization. It reads, "Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet." So here is the main paragraph, and it is one that is going to bedevil the legal environment of Israel and Palestine. It says, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Signed by Lord Balfour. Now, this very simple paragraph is jammed with ambiguity. If you were amongst the Jewish leaders of the Zionist Federation, and you were trying to determine what does this mean for the Jews, you would quickly discover that it's full of ambiguity. For example, what is a Jewish homeland? It's certainly not a nation state. The Jews were not to govern the mandate of Palestine, which was going to be governed by the British. So what does national home mean? Perhaps it means you could go in as many and large numbers as you wanted to migrate from Europe to Palestine. Would you be able to assume authority over the country once the British leave? All those questions are left open. What you would be happy about is that it mentions the Jewish people and it mentions a national home. So national and people are both used to describe Jews. And that is going to give the Jewish people a big leg up in the fight for legitimacy in the international community. Because if we look at how the Palestinians are referred to, in fact, we find much greater ambiguity. Because the key clause is the one that reads, "It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine." So how are the Arab Palestinians referred to? They're not referred to by name. They're referred to as the non-Jewish communities in Palestine. And this means that they're neither people, nor are they Palestinians. They're not referred to, like the Jewish people are, as a people. Why is this important? We have to look at this in the context of the League of Nations, which was established by the help and really under the authority of Woodrow Wilson at the end of World War I, in order to set up a new system of international law to prevent colonies and great powers from gobbling up the territory of the world. Woodrow Wilson declared as part of his 14 points that was embodied in the League of Nations that all peoples had the right to self-determination. This was revolutionary. It gave hope to many of the smaller peoples of the world that they would be able to free themselves of colonial domination. But of course, in the language of all peoples have the right to self-determination. How do you get self-determination? How do you become a nation state? You have to be a people first. In the Balfour Declaration, it's written that the Jews are a people and they have a right to a national home. For the Palestinian Arabs, of course, they don't achieve this level of recognition. They're defined as non-Jewish communities, and they have civil and religious rights. What does that mean? Of course, those are both very ambiguous terms. Civil rights are unclear. Religious rights means, of course, perhaps they can go to their mosques, they can pray, or their churches for the Christian Palestinians, who made up about 10% of the population of Palestine. But they don't have political rights. They certainly don't have national rights. And this problem of a non-identity is going to bedevil the Palestinians right up to the modern day. We see that it's only around the 1967 war that the Palestinian community develops the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, that fights through terrorism and other means to try to get the world to recognize them as a Palestinian people. But nowhere in international law does the word Palestinian get written down until 1993, during the Oslo Accords, when the United States, Israel, and the Palestinians sit down to talk peace. At that point, we get the first time that the Palestinians are recognized as a people. Previous to that, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was seen as a terrorist organization. It was illegal for any American official to talk to a member of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So it takes from 1917, when the Balfour Declaration was issued, until 1993, before the Palestinians are recognized in international law as a people who deserve the right to self-determination. And even then, they haven't arrived at their object of having a nation state. The Palestinian Authority that was established after Oslo Accords in the West Bank has been struggling to get national identity. The Americans and the Israelis see the Palestinian Authority and call it the Palestinian Authority, where the Palestinians call themselves the PNA, the Palestinian National Authority. They insert that word national in there because they want to achieve national rights. The United States and Israel are holding off giving that name to them until a final peace agreement is signed between Palestinians and Israelis, at which point they will achieve their national rights. But until that day, they remain only a Palestinian people with limited rights in the West Bank. And the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis continues. Those questions of identity are all embedded in this one little paragraph. For the Jews, it offered the hope of a national home and perhaps at the end of it, national independence. But before the Jews would achieve that, they would have to build up the institutions of a nation and finally go to war in 1948 in order to win and conquer the territory of Israel.
I believe Dr. Landis has hit the nail right on the head regarding the irretrievable root causes of the conflict currently raging in Israel. And I say irretrievable because if the Bible is true, then Jesus really is going to return, and from my standpoint, he is returning not only to end this conflict, but he will be doing it at the exact moment when all the Arab nations are in the act of a major attack on Israel with the intent of completely destroying the nation. Many people in this country and throughout the world are fearful that that very event could happen in the very near future, but I propose that it will not. It will happen, but again, if Scripture is true, the Jews must first build the temple and the sacrifices must begin, which should be the signal of the predicted 7-year period. Those references can be found in the following. The book of Daniel, chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, chapter 11, verse 31, and chapter 12, verse 11. And about the Antichrist, you will find him mentioned by Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, verse 15, and by the Apostle Paul in his letter to the Thessalonians, chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. And, of course, the many passages in Revelation about the beast, the main character representing the Antichrist. Again, the building of the temple should be the signal to set our clocks for the final countdown as to when, approximately, the final battle should or would occur. It would be at that time that Jesus would appear on the scene and end this conflict. Until then, keep expecting the terrorist community to intermittently continue their activities. So, as I mentioned, I have an assignment for you in addition to the passages just listed. You need to read chapters 37 through the end of the book of Ezekiel, chapter 39. Next, read chapter 14 of Zechariah, which is the last chapter of that book, and finally, read Revelation chapter 19, verse 11 to the end of the book. These passages will provide the basis for further discussion of what to expect during and through the conflict we call the tribulation, and more particularly about our future for the next millennia and beyond. That's all for now, and good reading.